N square. It won't be too depressing.
So with that, we want to tell you a story. We want to tell you a story that most people have never heard. It's about the Soviet Union, the United States, and a plan that couldn't possibly work until it did.
So the year is 1991. The Soviet Union is coming apart at the seams. And American scientists start to hear some troubling reports from their counterparts in Moscow that the Soviet nuclear infrastructure, much like the Soviet economy, is starting to disintegrate. There are reports of endemic corruption, reports of scientists and guards not getting their salaries, and reports of nuclear materials gone missing.
So this grapefruit is roughly the amount of plutonium that would be required to destroy a city. And this is something called nuke maps, which you could look at on your iPhone or your computer. Not right now would be excellent, maybe after the presentation. And you can put in your zip code or your city, and you can model for yourself, using some of their presets, what would happen if there was a nuclear detonation in your community. So for today's presentation, I have taken San Francisco, which is a city that many of us live and work in, and we've done a model of what would happen if a relatively small nuclear weapon, say 10 kilotons, which is, by the way, smaller than the bomb we dropped on Hiroshima, were to go off in the center of San Francisco. And while experts debate some of the details, we can safely say that tens of thousands of people would die or be critically injured, and that large swaths of the city would be contaminated and maybe uninhabitable for years, if not decades.
Now, this would be plutonium, but if we're talking about highly enriched uranium, it would be even easier to build a bomb. Now, you'd need more material, but not that much more, right? And essentially, to create a nuclear explosion using highly enriched uranium, you just need to smash two masses of it together fast enough. So once you have the material, it's not rocket science to build the bomb. And there are plans on the internet.
So imagine now that there's a whole supermarket aisle filled with these grapefruits, like this. And they're stacked 20 high, and they're lining the shelves. That's how much weapons-grade nuclear material the Soviet Union had when it fell. Now, they had whole cities dedicated to manufacturing and stockpiling this stuff, but they weren't alone. The US had its own aisle in the supermarket. But at that time, the Belarus and Ukraine and Russia and Kazakhstan, you can be fairly certain that that nuclear material was probably less secure than it would have been in an American supermarket.
So, to give you one example, in 1994, a colleague of mine visited Building 116 in Moscow. Now, when it was initially built, it was pretty remote. But as Moscow grew, it was actually within the city limits. It was overgrown. There were trees and shrubs growing everywhere. There were no monitors, no metal detector. When you went inside, the corridor was dimly lit, maybe one light bulb every 20 feet. Downstairs, there was a large vault, and on it was a small padlock. Superintendent with them fished out a ring of keys, opened up the door. Inside, along one side of the wall, were windows. Sunlight streamed in. There were no bars. On the other side of the room was what looked like red gym lockers, one after the other. Someone opened up a locker and took out a gleaming metal tube, laid it on the table. Inside of that tube was highly enriched uranium, bombs grade.
There were dozens of buildings, like Building 116, scattered across the Soviet Union. The 9/11 report details how Osama bin Laden was trying to get his hands on some of the fissile material from places just like this. And you can imagine that if a sophisticated non-state actor like Al-Qaeda got its hands on this material, they could have significantly changed life as we know it on this planet. And that's true today. I don't know how many people here read the AP report of the foiled attempt in Moldova just a few weeks ago to sell some of these very same weapons-grade materials to ISIS. But during the end of the Soviet Union, all that really stood between terrorist groups like that and the fissile materials that Carl's talking about was often a padlock or a wax seal.
So back to the early 1990s. Some scientists recognized this threat, and they went to their American counterparts. And this was a group of American scientists who they had met with on occasion as part of a series of foundation-supported exchanges by groups like the MacArthur Foundation and Carnegie Corporation of New York. And through these exchanges, the Americans quickly recognized these threats, and they were able to go to two senators, Senator Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar. They're pictured here, a Democrat and a Republican, and they built a bipartisan coalition to start to work with the Russians to secure some of these materials.
There were many reasons that this plan wouldn't work. The Americans and the Soviets were adversaries, after all, and there was this long history of distrust and espionage. And then there was the minor fact that a lot of the details of this plan were actually illegal under US law. One of the key innovators, though, in this whole process was a brilliant Harvard scholar. He had literally written the book on nuclear threat reduction, and his name is Ash Carter. A lot of you probably know his name because he's now our Secretary of Defense. But if coming up with this whole plan required a lot of policy innovation, implementing it required technical innovation. We had to figure out how to devise a system of gates and locks that both kept the outsiders out and guarded against malicious insiders. And how do you track all of these weapons-grade materials when a lot of the Russian records had been kept on paper and where every kilogram matters? And then what do you do with all the excess material?
So in 1991, an MIT researcher named Thomas Neff wrote an op-ed in the New York Times outlining a bold plan, the megatons to megawatts plan. Now, uranium can be used either, if it's at high enrichment, it can be used in bombs. At lower enrichment, it can be used in nuclear power plants. And so on this plan, the US would work with the Soviets. Money would come to essentially blend down this material so that it could be used in nuclear power plants. And there were a lot of economic incentives to keep this plan in place. Now, for 20 years, half of the fuel used in US nuclear reactors came from materials that had been destined for Soviet warheads. And since about 20% of our electricity in the US comes from nuclear power, that means that 1 in 10 light bulbs was lit by material that was headed for Soviet warhead. These very devices that were built to destroy our cities instead provided them with power.
I think it's really worth noting that on the American side of this equation, a lot of the important innovators were women. You can imagine the surprise of the senior Russian folks when they came to the table and discovered that their US counterparts were people like Liz Sherwood Randall, or Gloria Duffy, or Laura Holgate, all of whom were really instrumental in moving this cooperative threat reduction program forward.
And here's Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, who, while she was at the Ford Foundation, funded a lot of innovative work on this topic, and then took that with her to the State Department, where she works today to build support for cooperative threat reduction programs outside of the Soviet Union. So this is the next generation of that work. And this process has resulted in cooperative threat reduction programs in a whole variety of different countries, and has also led to the Nuclear Security Summit process, which you might have heard of, which has cleaned out weapons usable material from about 1/3 of the countries that possessed it.
But the nuclear threat hasn't gone away. Today, Jake said a couple things about the number of nuclear weapons there are in the world, but I wonder if anybody can guess how many tons of weapons-grade material still exist in the world today. Any idea? 20 tons? That's a great guess. It's off by a couple of zeros. It's 2,000 tons. There are 2,000 tons. You think about the size of this grapefruit, obviously not the same weight, but 2,000 tons of this material still exists. And as Jake said, 16,000 weapons, 9 countries have them. So all of this, as you can imagine, it means that we're open to all sorts of potential error, miscalculation, abuse. And so we find ourselves really in a race to secure these materials and even to eliminate them, as we've agreed to do under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But we have to do that before the system fails. because all complex systems eventually fail.
So there are dozens of stories involving nuclear accidents, like the time when someone on an Air Force plane flying over Florence, South Carolina, mistakenly pulled an emergency release pin and dropped an atomic bomb on Walter Gregg's backyard.
It was lucky that the nuclear core was stored somewhere else on the plane and we still have the Carolinas. But there was also a time when somebody working at the Titan II missile silo in Damascus, Arkansas, dropped a 6-pound socket wrench, which didn't seem like a big deal, except that it pierced the fuel tank and the nuclear-tipped Titan II missile exploded.
And these mistakes are not only in the past. Just a couple of years ago, nuclear cruise missiles were accidentally flown across the United States, and nobody really knew. So there's a lot to be improved.
So that brings us to almost the present. And that's the moment at which Carl and a bunch of his colleagues, some of whom are in the audience, offered me this crazy job, which was essentially to see if we couldn't stimulate innovation and bring some of the best and most creative minds of this generation back to this issue. And so it meant taking on something that relates to the most complex destructive weapons of all time and managing the materials that make them and navigating geopolitical tensions. And I knew virtually nothing about that topic, but I knew a lot about creative collaboration and strategy. And this was the perfect hybrid. Who could say no to that? So I said yes to working with these amazing experts.
So the five foundation partners wanted to bring new energy, new players, new ideas to the field. And we turned to Erika to bring us others who would say yes as well.
So we began looking for innovators. We were looking for people both in the field right now and people who were working on analogous challenges in other sectors or in other fields. And we met people, as you can see on the screen here, like Melissa Hannum and Brian Lee and Jeffrey Lewis at the Center for Nonproliferation Studies. They're doing amazing stuff using open source data and looking at Facebook and Twitter streams and geospatial analysis. We talked to Ivy Ross at Google Glass about how to take that formerly for the consumer market technology and think about how it could be used in this space. What are the new use cases for that technology to keep us safer and to monitor what's happening at nuclear weapons facilities potentially?
And we worked with Alex Glauser, he's in the middle there, who is at Princeton University and is working on it with advanced cryptography to solve one of the thorniest problems in arms control. If you're dismantling a warhead, how do you know that it's a real warhead and not a fake without revealing any of those sensitive design information? And that's Moritz Kutt, and he is working with open source software and with hackers to try to draw young people into the field and look at new approaches. That's Tamara Patton. She uses geospatial data and 3D modeling to give us insights into facilities that are some of the most closed facilities, but of great concern.
And then we heard about a couple of guys at the Natural Resources Defense Council, one of whom is here, and the Federation of American Scientists, who had created a serious game that would help people understand what it means to have 1,800 nuclear weapons on high alert, which means, by the way, that they can be deployed within 15 minutes of a command being given. You can imagine the fog of war. So we were interested in this serious game that they had developed.
So we thought they could work with Joe Tankersley here, who worked for 30 years at Epcot Center as a Disney Imagineer and creating experiences. And we brought dozens of people together, students, business leaders, social activists, you name it, and to have experiences where they were faced with nuclear risk. Here's a simulation of a crisis in Eastern Europe. Try to identify whether you would use nuclear weapons or under what circumstances.
And as I've told Carl, the baby boomers in the group surprised themselves at how close they came to nuclear war. But the students surprised us at how quickly they actually did it. So it comes down to this. We will either succeed in containing the nuclear threat or we won't. What does the world look like if we fail? Well, I probably don't have to say. It means a devastating toll. It means tremendous loss of life, long-standing social and economic repercussions. You can imagine what would happen to our civil liberties if there was a nuclear detonation in one of our cities. Every container passing through a port would be suspect. Goods would rot at the port. Financial markets would crash. No corner of the world would be unaffected.
So we're working towards a different kind of future, one in which nuclear materials are less vulnerable to illicit proliferation, a world where the International Atomic Energy Agency has the resources it needs to sniff out cheaters and deter abuse of dual-use technologies. We've seen in the Iran deal how much pressure is being put on the IAEA to be able to carry out its mission, but it often doesn't have the right resources. These are structural problems that will occur again and again because the gap between civilian use and military use is so small.
We're betting on a world in which people of all ages are knowledgeable about and understand how to engage meaningfully in containing nuclear risk.
So we could use your help, your creativity, your networks, your resources to help crack the code and bring in other innovators and influencers and increase the security of our existing arsenals, combat proliferation. There's a lot at stake, but we're counting on you.